So let's talk about James Buchanan, America's 15th president. His time in office, from 1857 to 1861, was literally the 4-year countdown to the Civil War. And here's the thing, he's almost always ranked as one of the worst presidents in U.S. history, which creates this fascinating puzzle. Because when you look at his resume, Buchanan was, on paper, one of the most qualified people to ever even run for president. So that's the central mystery we're going to unpack here. How did a man with this picture-perfect background, a guy many people were counting on to be a peacemaker, end up watching the nation completely spiral into chaos? All right, let's get into it. You have to picture the scene in 1856. The country was just being ripped apart over the issue of slavery. So a lot of Americans looked at Buchanan's decades of experience and thought, okay, here's a steady hand, here's a seasoned statesman who can finally calm things down and pull us back from the edge. And what a resume it was. I mean, the guy had done it all. He'd been in the House of Representatives, the Senate, he was Secretary of State, and even the U.S. Minister to Great Britain. This wasn't just a laundry list of jobs. This was decades navigating the absolute highest levels of American politics and foreign policy. So the expectations, they weren't just high. For a lot of people, he felt like the last best hope to actually save the Union. But here's the thing, no amount of experience could have truly prepared him for the storm that was brewing. Buchanan walked into the presidency at maybe the most explosive and divided moment in the nation's history. He wasn't just dealing with a political fight, he was inheriting a nation that was already on fire. And this really gets to the heart of the problem. You had two completely different worlds in one country. The North was industrializing, its economy built on the idea of free labor. Meanwhile, the South's entire way of life, its economy, its social structure, was completely dependent on the institution of slavery. These weren't just different opinions. They were two incompatible systems on a collision course. And as if things weren't bad enough, just months after he took office, a massive financial crisis slammed the country. They called it the Panic of 1857. Suddenly, railroads were going bankrupt, banks were collapsing, and unemployment was soaring. So now, on top of the country tearing itself apart, the economy was also in total ruin. So how did Buchanan respond? Well, he fell back on his core political beliefs. He was a Jacksonian Democrat through and through, which meant he believed a powerful federal government was a bad thing. He thought if the government stepped into the economy, it would only make things worse. But this hands-off approach was an absolute disaster. It left millions of struggling Americans feeling abandoned, and it completely tanked his reputation as a competent leader. So with the country already in a tailspin, Buchanan makes two critical decisions. Now, in his mind, these were meant to be the solutions, the moves that would finally end the debate over slavery for good. Instead, they were like throwing gasoline on the fire. They pushed the nation right over the edge. The first one was the Dred Scott decision. This was a huge Supreme Court ruling that basically said two things. First, that African Americans were not and could never be citizens. And second, that Congress had no power to ban slavery in the Western territories. Buchanan openly supported this. He really hoped this would be the final legal word that settled the whole issue. But the result was the exact opposite of what he wanted. Instead of calming things down, the ruling absolutely enraged the North. They saw it as the government forcing slavery on the entire country. At the same time, it emboldened the South and pretty much destroyed any last chance for a political compromise. His second huge misstep came in what's known as Bleeding Kansas. The territory was in the middle of a brutal, violent struggle over whether to allow slavery. And what does Buchanan do? He throws his support behind a pro-slavery constitution, even though it went directly against what most of the people living in Kansas actually wanted. That single move just shattered any image he had of being a fair, neutral leader. To many, it was proof he'd chosen a side. Okay, so fast forward to the final months of his presidency. Abraham Lincoln has just won the election of 1860, and the nation finally hits its breaking point. Southern states start to actually follow through on their threats to leave the Union. This was it, the ultimate test of leadership. And Buchanan's response? It would be defined by a kind of crippling inaction. See, Buchanan argued that even though a state leaving the Union was illegal, the Constitution didn't give him the power to use military force to stop them. He was a strict constitutionalist, and in his mind, his hands were tied. Of course, to his critics, this didn't look like principled leadership. It looks like he was completely giving up his responsibility as president. And the speed of the collapse was just
breathtaking. In December of 1860, South Carolina was the first to go. Then, over the next 2 months, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, and Louisiana followed. Then Texas. All while Buchanan was basically just watching from the White House. The United States was literally dissolving week by week. So by the time he packed his bags and left office in March of 1861, a total of 7 states had already seceded. They had already formed their own government, the Confederacy. He wasn't just handing Abraham Lincoln the keys to a troubled nation, he was handing him the keys to 2 separate, hostile countries on the brink of war.
So when all is said and done, how do we look back on his presidency? Well, historians have been pretty clear in their verdict, overwhelmingly calling it a failure. But it's worth taking a look at the full picture, the few things he did right versus the crises he completely failed to manage.
On the one hand, yeah, his experience in foreign policy was useful. He kept the U.S. out of foreign wars. And you could say he believed deeply in the letter of the Constitution. But those strengths were just totally mismatched for the problem at hand. His inaction as states left the Union, his disastrous support for the Dred Scott decision, and his bungling of the Kansas crisis, those were catastrophic failures. And really, that's the bottom line. His indecisiveness and his critical miscalculations didn't just fail to fix the country's problems, you can argue they actively made things worse. He left Abraham Lincoln a broken nation, with the fuse lit for the Civil War, which was just weeks away from exploding. Which leaves us with this final, really tough question. Was James Buchanan, the man with the perfect resume, the actual cause of the Civil War? Or was he simply the last man in charge who was unable to stop a conflict that was, by then, inevitable? It's a question that reminds us that sometimes, in a true crisis, all the experience in the world doesn't mean a thing without the wisdom and the courage to act.